At one point or another, all movie stars have acted in a complete flop that they have no emotional investment in, taking the role merely for a payday or because of a contractual reason. And it can often be easy for an actor to move on and disassociate themselves from a questionable role, but it's not always possible for directors to do the same. Here then are 10 examples of when directors were less than pleased with the theatrical cut of a film they had signed on to create. I'm Cy for WhatCulture.com, and these are 10 directors who absolutely hated their own movies. Number 10. Alex Proyas, Dark City. Alex Proyas was a renowned music video director who worked with the likes of INXS and Fleetwood Mac during the late 80s, and then with his first movie The Crow in 1994, he created a renowned gothic thriller converted from a dark comic book series which elevated his profile and set him on a path to writing and directing his follow-up feature, Dark City. But the version that hit the cinema was far from the film Proyas had envisioned from the start. Dark City was an adventurous concept blending mind-bending sci-fi with the feel of a classic 40s film noir. Although visually it was executed perfectly, the overly complicated story did not convert as well to the screen. Proyas had been restricted with various production constraints on the theatrical cut and was less than satisfied with the version that was initially released. However, he would eventually aim to put right the various wrongs as he saw them with his director's cut that would hit the DVD and Blu-ray market. Alex changed the intro to the movie, setting a completely different narrative tone which helped to keep more of an air of mystery surrounding the shadowy main antagonists of the story. He also extended the runtime by 11 minutes, allowing him to focus on some much needed character development amongst the supporting cast, while also making some adjustments to the colour palette to create even more of the noir feel he had originally intended. Number 9. Kevin Reynolds, Waterworld. In the mid-90s, the notion of the summer blockbuster had been elevated thanks to the enormous success of Jurassic Park. And with his roles in the likes of Dances with Wolves and Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves, Kevin Costner was one actor with some serious star power come the middle of the decade. He was also an Oscar-winning director and had already been part of the production team on a number of successful movies by the time he was brought in to help create and take the leading role in Waterworld. However, directing the movie had been assigned to Kevin Reynolds, who Costner had previously worked with on Robin Hood. The relationship of the two creatives would become incredibly strained by the difficult production and spiraling costs of Waterworld, as the reality of creating a post-apocalyptic Mad Max-style adventure movie on water became all too apparent. Costner fought to gain more control of the creative process, using his star power to insist on script rewrites and the reshooting of scenes. Director Reynolds would eventually walk during pre-production, allowing his former friend the opportunity to finish editing the movie in his own image. Costner focused on the action sequences of the film rather than the essential world building, and as reported in the Daily Express, Reynolds would famously remark at the time, Kevin should only star in movies he directs, that way he can work with his favourite actor and director. Burn. Number 8. Josh Trank, Fantastic Four. After the runaway success of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, 20th Century Fox decided to reboot the relatively successful franchise of Fantastic Four, which had first been released in 2005 with an origin story and then followed up with the sequel Fantastic Four Rise of the Silver Surfer in 2008. Josh Trank was coming off the back of creating the darker indie superhero movie Chronicle and was tasked with co-writing and directing the picture. Trank showed again that he was keen to portray a darker tone and narrative and has suggested his vision was heavily influenced by horror and sci-fi master David Cronenberg. Displeased with the direction Trank was heading in, the producers started tinkering with the script while he was filming, completely rewriting the ending and forcing a creative barrier between the director and the studio. In post-production, much of the editing control was removed from Trank as the studio perceived the need to fix the movie that fans of the Fantastic Four had such high hopes for. This left Josh Trank utterly demoralised before publicly criticising 20th Century Fox and his treatment while making the film. He tweeted a day before its release saying, "A year ago I had a fantastic version of this and it would have received great reviews. You'll probably never see it." Fantastic Four would fail dismally at the box office, losing tens of millions of dollars, and would see the studio shelving their plans for an immediate sequel. Number 7. Guillermo del Toro, Mimic. Visionary Mexican director Guillermo del Toro found award-winning success with his debut feature film made in his native country, Cronos. The subsequent exposure saw him receive attention from Miramax, who offered him the chance to direct Mimic in 1997, a sci-fi horror monster story in which del Toro saw the potential to really make his mark on the American movie scene. However, as the director got to work, he soon found that Miramax boss Bob Weinstein would start interfering in the creative process, making demands on the tone and style that he was creating for the film. The inevitable fallout almost saw del Toro sacked from the project, though he would finish shooting before being forced to hand over the final cut of the film to the producers. While the theatrical version of Mimic is by no means a total disaster when compared stylistically to other del Toro movies such as Pan's Labyrinth and Crimson Peak, it's clear to see that he didn't have the total creative control of the film that he would have liked, or all that his reputation nowadays would have afforded him. Number 6. John Carpenter, Memoirs of an Invisible Man. Legendary horror master John Carpenter helped kickstart the slasher genre with Halloween before creating a succession of beloved movies in the 80s such as Escape from New York, The Thing, and They Live, which are all now considered classics of the era. However, Carpenter's films in the 90s were not so revered, and on Memoirs of an Invisible Man in 92, he had returned to making a movie for a paycheck rather than having the total creative influence in the initial writing, production, or soundtrack which had been so critical in his distinctive style. Carpenter was reluctant to work outside of his comfort zone, but due to a long-running legal dispute had not made a film for a few years, and so agreed against his better judgment. Chevy Chase was the star of the movie and pretty much called the shots as far as the production team were concerned. Carpenter had only come on board after original director Ivan Reitman had walked after clashing with the star over the direction of the picture. Carpenter's relationship with Chase fared no better, and he also fell out with the film's other star Daryl Hannah. The result was no bad movie by any stretch of the imagination, but a film that felt very un-Carpenter-like. The director has since stated the experience of working on Memoirs of an Invisible Man had made him want to quit making films altogether, once referring to the experience as a horror show. Number 5. Wes Craven, Swamp Thing. 2 years before Wes Craven became a household name following the release of his career-defining horror A Nightmare on Elm Street, he'd written and directed Swamp Thing, an early DC Comics adaptation. Craven had to deliver the movie on a modest $2.5 million, and it's clear from viewing the final cut that a far higher budget was required in order to realise his vision. The B-movie level special effects and costumes of the monsters were comically bad throughout, and fell well short of Craven's expectations when writing the film. Following cult horror successes with the likes of The Last House on the Left and The Hills Have Eyes, Craven was hoping that by filming Swamp Thing it would make him more attractive to major studios as a director who could handle action, stunts, and known stars. Ultimately, the end product did little to enhance his reputation. After being forced to cut what he considered to be important scenes written for the third act in order to stay under budget, as well as being underwhelmed with the ludicrous costume designs, Wes felt he had blown his chance and was thoroughly depressed with the backlash. However, in the aftermath he would start penning the script for his next movie, and in creating the iconic Freddy Krueger, would find his true calling by returning to his horror roots. Number 4. Tony Kaye, American History X. Tony Kaye is a renowned music video director who has created the visuals for some huge rock hits, including Soul Asylum's Runaway Train and Danny California by the Red Hot Chili Peppers. But he is best known for making one of the most important cult movie hits of the late 90s, American History X. The movie infamously tells the story of two brothers' involvement in the white power skinhead movement. In the role of the elder sibling was an Edward Norton who was well on his way to becoming a superstar and was just 1 year away from his career-defining role in Fight Club. As the younger brother, there was Edward Furlong in his most prominent role since his debut in James Cameron's Terminator 2 Judgment Day. But despite American History X's relative success, Kaye would disown his involvement in the movie after he clashed with New Line Cinema in post-production, and the producers allowed Edward Norton in on the editing process against Kaye's wishes. The final theatrical cut was longer than Kaye intended and featured scenes that he did not want to include. Instead of promoting the film as per his contract, Kaye decided to speak out against Norton, the producers, and his treatment by New Line. He attempted to remove his name from the credits and even tried to unsuccessfully sue the studio, none of which did his reputation as a director any favours in terms of future filmmaking opportunities. Number 3. Ridley Scott, Blade Runner. 1982's Blade Runner is widely considered to be one of the greatest films of the 80s and one of the greatest ever science fiction movies, period. It's a stylishly futuristic dystopian neo-noir brought to life by Ridley Scott, who had already created the sci-fi classic Alien in 1979. But the production was far from plain sailing for Scott, as he had a number of high-profile disagreements with star Harrison Ford, and then against his better judgment was forced by producers to include a voice-over narration by Ford's character Deckard that he absolutely despised and felt detracted from the sentiment of the movie. However, following the cult success of Blade Runner on home video release, Scott was eventually allowed to return to the movie and release his director's cut a decade later in 1992. Finally, Ridley was able to remove Deckard's voiceover whilst adding a fantasy sequence which strongly hinted at the origins of the main character, with a twist that had only been very subtly hinted at in the original cut. Ridley Scott has since returned to Blade Runner once again and created his further final cut, which was released in 2017. Providing his ultimate version of the film some 25 years after its release, Scott once again tinkered with the theatrical version that he was clearly never fully happy with. Number 2. Zack Snyder, Justice League. When Justice League was released in 2017, it should have been the jewel in the Warner Brothers and DC crown, and they needed to produce something special in order to keep up with the success that rivals Marvel were experiencing with their cinematic universe. Zack Snyder had been handpicked to bring Superman back to the big screen in Man of Steel, and Justice League was to be the completion of the trilogy following Batman v Superman: Dawn of Justice. Tonally, Snyder's movies were taking the series in a far darker direction than the competition were producing, and there were studio concerns at the largely negative reception to Batman vs Superman. When a tragic death in Snyder's family forced him to step down from the project during post-production, Warner Brothers pressed on with the film by bringing in co-writer Josh Whedon, who had directed Avengers Assemble and Age of Ultron. Whedon was tasked with brightening the colour palettes, reshooting numerous scenes, and greatly condensing the picture down to a 2-hour runtime from over 4 hours of filmed footage. The result was a movie with just far too much going on, sacrificing important character development while coming across as two opposing ideologies incoherently slapped together. Snyder was naturally disappointed, but after an unprecedented online fan campaign, Warner Brothers did eventually allow him to finish his vision, with his Snyder Cut being released in 2020. At number 1, David Lynch, Dune. 1965's Dune was one of the most celebrated space fantasy books of the era, and plans to adapt for the screen began as early as 1971, with an unsuccessful attempt made by Ridley Scott, among others. A decade later, David Lynch was riding high following the success of his second full-length movie, The Elephant Man. Lynch was approached to take on the project and was in agreement so long as he would also be given the opportunity to write the screenplay. With a genre in vogue following the success of Star Wars, a celebrated novel as source material, and a hot young director at the helm, early signs were that the Dune movie had all the hallmarks of being a hit. But when Lynch's plan to split the material across 2 films was dismissed, it took the filmmaker a total of 6 further drafts to condense the material into just 1 movie. Even then, as the budget inflated to over $40 million, with a significant sized crew required to pull off the vast operation, Lynch had filmed over 4 hours of film on his rough cut and was asked to condense this down to just 2. The director felt that he was completely selling out by having his hand forced in adhering to the request, and thus subsequently disowned the theatrical version, which was eventually released in 1984 and bombed at the box office. And that's the list. Let us know what you thought of this video down in the comments below. Which of these directors do you feel were justified in their hatred of their movies, and maybe some that were perhaps not so much? Make sure you like this video, share it with your friends, subscribe and hit that notification bell. Head over to whatculture.com for more content on the daily. I've been Cy for What Culture, and have a good week.